Greetings, all of you historians out there. Today we're going to be talking about a very big question in the study of history, and that is, what is history and why do we study it? Now, I want to get right to the point and say we're going to define history very generally here and say that history is the study of the past. So, if we're studying ancient Egyptian civilization 4,000 years ago, that's part of the past. If we're studying things that happened last week, part of the past as well. We're going to use different tools to study these different eras. We would probably have different reasons for studying them. We would face different challenges and have different opportunities. But all of this goes together in the study of history. So that's a pretty broad spectrum of time to be looking at, essentially all the time that's already happened. So how do we study such a thing? Luckily, we have historians. Now, historians really take many different forms. A lot of people can be a historian. A journalist can be a historian. They're recording events or reporting on happenings of the time. But an ancient scribe can also be a historian when they do the very same thing very many years ago. There's anthropologists, there's archaeologists, there's geologists. All of these people have something to say about the study of history. And so we'll be turning to all of them for clues as we continue our study. But today I want to go over some basic terms that we're going to talk about when we talk about history. So because we're talking about the ancient world, one of our most important sources is going to be the world of archaeology. So archaeologists study the distant past in a number of ways. You might be most familiar with the idea of excavation, of actually digging up ruins of ancient civilizations, and indeed this is an incredibly important part of their work. But it might include other things as well, translating languages found on ancient tablets, studying trade routes and seeing how civilizations interact with one another by seeing if artifacts from one civilization have made it to another. Archaeologists are incredibly important for the study of the ancient world, and without them we really wouldn't know nearly as much as we do. Archaeologists deal primarily in two types of clues. For the sake of ease, we're going to split them into fossils and artifacts. Fossils we'll define as any remains of something that was once alive. So it doesn't have to be part of that thing that used to be alive. For example, an imprint of a leaf can be a fossil. The preserved footstep of a dinosaur can be a fossil, but also the things you normally think of as fossils as well. Preserved skeletons, if you go to the museum and see an ancient animal like a dinosaur, we're talking about fossils. Artifacts, on the other hand, are the remains of things that were created and used by humans. So it could be something very small, like an arrowhead, basically just a triangular rock or piece of slate, something small like a bead or a piece of jewelry, or an artifact can be something very large indeed. So it could be the remains of a weapon or of a vehicle like a chariot. An artifact can be something that's been written down. It could be an old garment. Anything created and used by humans that we find today, I'm going to call an artifact. So broadly speaking, most of the clues, most of the sources we're going to talk about in ancient history can fall into one of these categories, and both are very important for getting a full picture of a society. But next I want to talk about sources a little bit more generally. So when we're thinking about sources in history, we're basically asking, well, where are we getting all of this information from? Everything written down in a textbook you might be reading, or if you're browsing through Wikipedia, how do we come to have all of this information that now we are so happy to have and excitedly talk about? So we're going to break down historical sources into two main areas. You've probably already heard of them, primary and secondary sources. So let's explain what they mean quickly first. Primary sources are any source that is, any information that is created by somebody who was a witness or a participant in an event or series of events or whatever time period is being discussed, right? So if somebody saw something happen themselves, they're a primary source. If they wrote that down, even better. Somebody who took part in an event is a primary source as well. So if you're researching the history of a specific battle or something like that, and you found the diary of a soldier, that would be a primary source because they participated in the battle itself. But likewise, if somebody managed to observe that battle or any other event, and they witnessed it themselves, then they would also be a primary source. A secondary source is essentially anything that is not that. So a secondary source is whenever we get information or perspective from somebody who did not themselves directly participate in or witness the event or events in question. So if a reporter went around and talked to people after the fact, after some sort of event that we're interested in, that would be a secondary source, a news report. If we read the chronicles of a famous ancient historian who listed the different emperors or dynasties of their civilization, it would be a secondary source as well, except maybe if they're talking about the one that they're living in or under currently. Right? So we have primary sources and secondary sources. Now, sometimes people get a little bit confused with the name primary, meaning more important or better in some way. And primary sources are not necessarily better than secondary sources, and secondary sources are not necessarily better than primary sources. They're just very different. And the primary thing to think about is the quality of the source itself, right? So when we're thinking about the source, we want to think about who created it, if we know, and why they created it, if they know. And analyzing the source based on that, rather than simply based on if it's primary or secondary only, would be very useful, right? So for instance, if we had a secondary source that was created by a historian who was trying to create a full account of a particular historic event, and they've talked to many different people involved and analyzed artifacts for themselves, and they've put together kind of a comprehensive view. They've made a whole book about the subject that's been very thoroughly researched through all of these different investigations that they've done. Well, that sounds like a really terrific source for learning about that event. And if there was somebody who participated in the event and whose life was really impacted by the outcome, maybe this event was really great for them, or maybe they think that it was completely unfair that this event turned out the way that it did. Well, because they have something to stake in it, they could easily be very biased in reporting it. And likewise, maybe they're not biased at all and they're doing the best they can, but because they're involved, they really only have one view of the issue, right? They were only able to actually experience it from the limited perspective of themselves. So in that way, that primary source might be very limiting. But the opposite is possible also. A primary source might be better because you have fresh information, you have first-hand information. A story doesn't change as it's told from person to person to person if we go right to the source of the story, and that certainly sounds better for a historian. And likewise, a secondary source might get information that's been distorted over time, or through the repeated tellings, things are exaggerated or things are forgotten. Either way. So we see that there's no one category that's better than the other, but there are certainly sources within both categories that could be more or less useful to us depending on the quality. So a few more terms to talk about here. So if an archaeologist primarily is interested in the physical remains, whether they be artifacts or fossils, then we'll turn to the anthropologist to look more at the cultural artifacts of a society. So basically, if we're investigating the culture of a society, we'll turn to anthropology, which, when you get long enough ago, blends with archaeology in some significant ways, right? But when we're thinking about the culture of a civilization, whether it's an ancient civilization or a modern civilization, this could actually mean something rather complicated. After all, what is the definition of human culture? If we talk about culture today, we usually are talking about certain types of culture, so we say that something like the opera has a high cultural value, and that's higher than, a TV show or some lesser, allegedly, form of entertainment. So we use culture to mean something very specific. We often use culture to mean what we view as the height or pinnacle of the culture we're experiencing, but I want to get rid of that definition. The culture of a civilization is everything that civilization does that expresses the uniqueness or diversity of that culture as compared to other human civilizations, right? So essentially, if you looked at two different civilizations and you can tell them apart, what are the ways in which you can tell them apart? And that's a pretty good way of viewing the culture of a civilization. So when we look at different civilizations, what are the different things about them that can be distinct? What are the different aspects of civilizations? It's another way of saying that. So some of them are visually obvious, things like architecture or things like fashion. What kind of buildings does a civilization build? What kind of clothing do people wear? Those are pretty visual, and so they strike us first. And both of them can actually tell you a lot about that culture and what it values, right? So if we look at architecture, you can learn a lot about how these people adapted to whatever environment they found themselves in, right? So architecture is often a response to the geography or to the climate of a region. If you live in a colder climate, you're going to be building in a different way than if you live in a warmer climate. If you live in a mountainous climate, you'll build in a different way than if you don't live in such an environment, right? But it also is an artistic expression as well. So within the bounds of geography, within the bounds of climate, architecture is also kind of a artistic response, a cultural response as well. And the same goes for fashion, what kinds of clothing people wear. In the early stages, we might say that this is simply a response to the climate or environment, whether you need warm clothing, whether you need less warm clothing, whether you need clothing that's going to help you stay cool, etc. But then likewise, obviously, fashion also becomes an artistic representation of what is important or unique about that culture. We have things like cuisine. We have things like food. So what types of food and how do you cook food? How do you serve food? What is the sort of significance of food in a society? These are all cultural expressions as well. So again, some of this is down to the environment. The types of food that people cook or cook with often have something to do with what's indigenous to the area, right? You can cook with the plants or with the animals that you have available to you. And this distinction can lessen as time goes on and there's more globalization and there's more trade, but we would still definitely say that different regions have different types of cuisine and that there are different unique identities of, types of human cooking, right? And so this is partially a response, but also partially an expression. And we're going to find that that is sort of a common theme whenever we're talking about culture. Partially a response and partially an expression, or expressing a response in different ways, at least. So things like religion as well, obviously a part of a civilization's culture. Religion is both determined by other things in a civilization and then likewise determines things in a civilization. So if you're thinking about early religions that are often or were often used as an explanation for a natural phenomenon. If you have to explain to yourselves where lightning comes from and you come up with a sort of supernatural or religious justification for that, then likewise it also then can affect what your culture does. What cultural practices then go into worshiping that lightning god that you just invented. We want to use somebody like Zeus as an example, right? So we have, again, kind of a feedback loop. Culture is a response, but then culture also becomes an expression in which turn other things respond to. So this is really the realm of anthropology, and we can go on in our discussion about culture with everything from art, which we'll certainly talk about, to music, which we'll certainly talk about. All of these things varying from civilization to civilization and showing the real diversity of human adaptation and expression that has happened over time. Really, any way that humans can live, we have lived somewhere at some time in some place. And part of what is so interesting about studying history is that it can really break our ideas of how society has to be. Are there certain things in our society that have to be the way they are based on, just the idea that humans are essentially one way? When we look at ancient history especially, we can see the incredible diversity of different ways that people have lived, adapted to their environments, expressed themselves, and ultimately forged civilizations spanning the eons, really. So, I think that this is going to be an incredibly interesting area to get into together. And as we move through the class, as we move through talking about each of these civilizations in turn, we're going to circle back and use all of these tools and techniques that we talked about. That should pretty much do it for our first unit, and I'll talk to you again soon. So see you later, historians.